Thank you all for coming today to this webinar, Making Persuasive Arguments for Adult Education and Literacy, and we're going to be highlighting Pro-Literacy's new Advocacy Toolkit. Just to reassure everyone, Michelle, if you'll advance, we are recording this webinar, so we'll send out a follow-up email on Monday with links to the webinar recording, to the slideshow that people are going to be using today. We're going to put together a little presentation summary. It's just like one sheet that highlights all the links that are shared and the key points that David, Jackie, and Michelle talk about today. So that's going to be a great resource for you if you want to share with your colleagues and coworkers. We'll also put together a chat transcript and a transcript of the Q&A. And for those of you who are attending, we'll also include a certificate for you. A little bit about the Zoom controls. We're going to ask today that you use the chat function if you know, to introduce yourself like you have already. If you want to share links and resources with the group, you can post those in the chat. When the presenters have links that they're talking about, I will try to post those into the chat so you can click on them and go and see the resources they're actually talking about, and just to ask questions to other people in the group. We will ask that you use the Q&A feature specifically to ask questions, content questions of the presenters. During the webinar and at the end, we're going to go through those questions. And the Q&A feature just allows us to track and make sure everybody's questions get answered. We will stop taking questions at the top of the hour, but the presenters have agreed to stay on past that top of the hour and make sure everyone's questions get answered. And we'll cover that again at the end of the webinar. Michelle, next slide. For those of you who signed up for this webinar, if you go to proliteracy.org/webinars, you can see our overall webinar schedule. I think we've got it filled out through December, and we're in the process of recruiting webinars for January. But you'll see all the webinars we have to offer. You can register for webinars there. You can also see links to recordings of our previous webinars and a little bit about the upcoming webinars. So this is the first in a series of 3 webinars about the Advocacy Toolkit. On December 9th, we're going to have some presenters who are going to talk about successful state and local advocacy efforts. And then on December 16th, we're going to have another group of people who are going to come in and talk about kind of successful messaging efforts and kind of making the case, not in a large advocacy way, but in a smaller kind of messaging way for key stakeholders. And then we also have some of our other webinars around creating a digital literacy action plan and conversation clubs on Zoom. All right, so that's all that I have for you today, and I'm going to turn things over to Michelle, Jackie, and David. You guys take it away.
Thanks, Todd. Hi, everybody. This is Michele Diecuch. I wanted to first let you know who will be your presenters for today. So I'm the Senior Director of Programs at Pro-Literacy, and joining me today is Jackie Taylor, adult learning and literacy activist for a very long time, and also the Director of Jackie Taylor Consulting. David Rosen, who many of you probably know, is the co-founder of Open Door Collective. He's also the moderator for some links listservs, and he's also a board member for Pro-Literacy. Okay, I wanted to start out just by giving a quick snapshot of the overall federal funding picture and state funding picture for adult education and literacy. No surprise, this year has been a little bit unpredictable for federal funding in many ways. But just to start out, I wanted to let you know that as of yesterday, right now we are on a continuing resolution to keep the government open through December 11th. There is speculation that there could be another continuing resolution for federal fiscal year 2021 funding. And then there also is speculation that an omnibus bill could be rolled up into funding for its stimulus as well. So a little lack of clarity as of this morning. That was the situation. We will continue to keep our network informed about all of that legislation and that funding. we know that the relief funding is really important for adult education organizations and especially the students that we serve. Right now, if there is a funding package passed before the end of the year, it will likely be something relatively small and more of a stopgap measure, and more legislation will have to be adjusted and presented after January 20th. Really quickly, a group related to the National Coalition for Literacy and Open Door Collective, David Rosen has been part of this team, has been communicating with the Biden transition team to try to get in front of them and let them know why adult education and literacy is an important piece of any economic relief and important in general. So that's something that's going on right now, and we'll continue to keep you updated on that. And as it relates to state funding, I put that in bold on purpose because it is likely that federal funding, regardless of what it looks like, whether it's continuing resolution or funding, more importantly for next year, is going to look pretty flat. We likely could see it flat or more likely declining due to the obvious reasons with everything going on in the world right now. So state funding will be particularly important. It's really important. Jackie and David will get a little into this a little bit longer later into the presentation, but it's really important for you all to be advocating at the state level, really getting involved when those state budgets are proposed and speaking to them, letting them know that right now is not the time to be cutting adult education. Adult education and literacy is so crucial to any economic relief and helping those who are unemployed. So as Todd mentioned, we have a new toolkit, Advocacy Toolkit for Adult Education and Literacy. And just, we're obviously going to go into a lot of detail later in the presentation, but just an overall snapshot of this. It was designed to help individuals and organizations advocate for adult education and literacy in both the private and public sectors. It's designed so that it can be used by anyone. So someone who is very new to advocacy efforts and those who are more experienced. It's a very large document, but you can use all or parts of it. So those who are more experienced may choose to choose one particular part related to public funding or private funding. It's designed so that you can jump around and use different parts of it. I want to shift now to some of the reasons behind this advocacy toolkit. Most of you are probably familiar with the PIAAC estimates, Program for the International Assessment of Adult Competencies, that was done back in 2014. In April of 2020, PIAAC released state and county synthetic estimates, which are really important. The field has been really looking forward to this so that they can take a look at literacy levels, numeracy levels within their states and counties. So I want to point this out that this is the PIAAC skills map. I have the URL at the bottom, and I did want to just remind everybody about what Todd mentioned. We will have the URLs available from the recording, and then he also puts together a summary of all of the resources listed in this website, in this presentation, for you to have afterwards. That will be sent to you.
And Michelle, I'm also posting the links in the chat if people want to link to them.
Great, thanks Todd. But this is a picture of what that skills map looks like. It's interactive, it's great. You can go in and find the literacy and numeracy levels for your state or your county. You can compare county to county. It's a really great tool. Going on with that, another resource that we mention in our advocacy toolkit is the literacy gap map that Barbara Bush Foundation did. This takes some of the literacy and numeracy estimates from the PIAAC data and combines it with other stats related to social issues and demographics, such as health measures, economic status, education level, etc., so that you can put together a full picture for those that you want to present information to about adult education and literacy and why it's important in your particular area. Folding both of those pieces into something that's also in the toolkit, Pro Literacy created what we called an Adult Literacy Impact Report. It's a 2-page template for programs to use. They can go into the PIAAC skills map or the Barbara Bush Foundation gap map and populate the template with stats from your local area or your state if you choose. And then there are areas to use where you can add information about student impact, progress data from your local program. You'll see that there's a logo of a local program at the top. You can make it very personalized. A lot of legislators like to see a quick snapshot, a 2-pager, a 1-pager about what impact you're having in your local area. So this is a URL to that impact report, and we're happy to help you in any way to help populate that piece. Okay, with that said, that's just the intro. The PIAAC data is so important and it's a big piece of this advocacy toolkit. I'm going to turn it over to Jackie.
Thank you, Michelle. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started and dig right into the toolkit itself. And with the time that we have today, this will be just a very high-level introduction. And as Michelle and Todd mentioned, we'll have follow-up webinars where we can dig in deeper on some of the topics. But the Advocacy Toolkit itself is designed to help you advocate for adult education and literacy funding in both for both public and private funding. It's divided into 5 sections, ultimately ending with the appendices. It's for new advocates, for program directors, regional and state associations or coalitions. And not only does it offer tools for you, but it is designed to help you plan your advocacy in whatever area you feel you need to focus on. So we'll talk more about the planning tools that are sprinkled throughout the toolkit in a little bit here. But each section begins with the key takeaways. And the key takeaways are just a bulleted list to help you know whether the content in a particular section is relevant to you at the time that you're using the toolkit. So you can decide to dig into one and not the other. So think of it like a buffet. You take what you want and leave the rest. So the details then follow. This is like really the meat of it. And it talks about the how-tos, how to approach, communicate with, and persuade others to act on behalf of adult education and literacy. Each section then also contains a list of bulleted best practices, what we know from research and from experience from advocacy efforts across the country, California, Illinois, Massachusetts, New York, Ohio, places, what's worked in adult education and literacy with our advocacy efforts. And the toolkit also provides links to many of the best tools available to us, as well as case studies from across the country and different examples in practice. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is an example of a key takeaways section. And the key takeaways introduce sections 1 through 4, and they really help to get a toe into the particular topic. And this example happens to be from part 3, advocating with state and local legislators. And the key takeaways sum up the main elements for advocating these particular key takeaways for advocating with policymakers. So I bulleted a few of them here to give you just a sense of what they look like. They just cut to the chase and boom, boom, boom. Next slide, please. Okay, and so beginning on page 7 is part 1. And part 1 provides a background on PIAAC, the PIAAC proficiency measures, and some of the tools that Michelle mentioned. And it also contains a list of questions at the end, several pages worth, that help you plan your advocacy efforts. And if you're working directly from the PDF, not from a hard copy, you can type straight into the document. So you can enter your notes in these different fields, you can check off boxes, you can highlight, and it will save all of that for you as you go, and you can change it and update it as needed. Next slide, please. Okay, so part 2 introduces developing effective messaging in the ask, starting with page 23. And part 2 is devoted to helping advocates frame adult education and literacy in the context of larger issues. So how do you create compelling hooks? This is where you talk or write about adult education and literacy in a way that hooks it to the audience's broader interests, such as reducing poverty or improving the economy. And this particular example, it illustrates how adult education and literacy is essential in helping adults get the skills they need to get and keep a job, ultimately revitalizing the economy. Now, we've all made this sort of a pitch before probably, but what's different about this particular message is that in the document, it links to the different tools you need to access your local city, local county, state data to plug in so that you're customizing the message along with your ask specific to your local area, and it's handy. So next slide. Okay, again, this is just another example of the key questions at the end of part 2, wrapping it up and helping you to think through your advocacy planning, and in this particular case, drafting your messaging and your ask. And again, the PDF is editable, so you can keep your notes in there. Next slide, please. Okay, part 3, advocating with state and local legislators, beginning on page 35, talks about how several things. First, how state legislative processes are typically organized and when advocates need to act. The key elements of effective advocacy, what makes it work and work well, including grassroots, social advocacy, cultivating champions, and more. It talks about what effective advocacy looks like with case studies and examples. How-tos of calling, writing, and meeting with legislators, cinching commitments, testifying in hearings, and conducting state house rallies. It then also goes into the virtual realm, so virtual campaigns through social media, used to amplify, involve, and hold policymakers accountable. And since we created the toolkit during the pandemic, we included a section on how to conduct a meeting remotely with legislators and their aides. So in this particular example, starting on page 38, we have synopses of successful advocacy conducted by local programs, regional coalitions, and state associations. Many of you may be members of some of these groups that are here today. These link through to detailed case studies found in the appendices. Next slide, please. Okay, so one example of putting the toolkit to use is to find out what advocates could do now to influence public policy at the state level. So on page 47 of the toolkit, there's a discussion of the state budget cycle. Most states will have, if you look at this chart for a minute, I know it's a little bit blurry because we had to blow it up, but it's in clear, crisp detail in the toolkit. Most states will have their governors submitting budgets to their legislatures in January and on into February possibly. So the legislature usually then takes until May or June to come up with their version of the budget, which then goes back to the governor for signing or vetoing, right? So while technically the governors are finalizing their budget recommendations, according to this chart, in November and December, we are also nearing the end of that phase of the process, so the timeline for action is tight. And also, unless they were newly elected in November, they will have had their executive departments already working on those budgets as early as July, August, and maybe even on into September. So much of the governor's budget proposal for the next year is pretty well set. So advocates may want to put their focus on the state legislature now, since they really don't start budget development until the governor's proposal arrives. So that would be in January. So I think the timing is right for getting organized so that you're ready to hit the ground running after the new year. And the budget cycle varies somewhat from state to state. So the toolkit links to a state-specific schedule from the Council of State Governments. So you can look it up there, or you can go to your state legislature's website. Some of them have some good details on the budget process. Next slide, please. Okay, so lawmaking process differs from the budget making process. And the toolkit, this is just an example of the toolkit. We tried to make it easy to find out the best timing for your state. So there are flow charts and again, other tools that I mentioned that you can click through to learn, when you can intersect the process with your advocacy efforts. When are the key decisions being made? And when those are happening is when advocates should mobilize. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, as I mentioned, the toolkit also has several campaign examples throughout. This particular one is from California. I just wanted to mention it, but there are plenty in there. You should really look at them. It's fascinating. Some of the things the advocates have done successfully. So in this particular example, the LA Unified School District several years ago had proposed to eliminate the largest adult education program in the nation. So LA responded with a unique call campaign where the organizer developed a custom-coded bilingual app that handled 1.5 million seconds of constituent calls. So in other words, people would call one number and be routed to their elected officials in the district where their adult school was located. The app then provided them talking points. Flyers were placed in business windows and even projected on the side of an adult school next to the busy 10 freeway. So offices were overwhelmed, and combined with other strategies, advocates were successful and funding was restored. So we'll have guests in our next webinar to talk about local and state advocacy work, and we'll see the dates at the end. So next slide, please. And again, part 3 wraps up with some key questions. In this case, it links through to the key elements of effective advocacy in part 3, and you can continue to, take your notes and so forth. Next slide. Okay, so part 4, advocating for funding in the private realm, discusses how to advocate with individual donors, foundations, and corporations. And it begins by explaining the similarities and differences in advocating in both sectors, public and private. It gives detailed strategies, just like the rest of the toolkit does, bulleted lists of strategies. It also shares the research, for example, who donated the most in 2019, which was individual donors that comprised of 69% of total giving, not counting bequests. So, and then why do people not donate again? So in this particular chart, you can see, top 3 reasons: they were not acknowledged or thanked. They were not asked to donate again. Then lack of communication about the use of funds, the impacts and outcomes. So it goes on to present other research as well as bulleted best practices for advocating for private funding. So part 4, I think, began on page 80. And the next slide, please. And we wrap up with the appendices, again, where we have the detailed case studies, state association resources. If you don't know, if you have a state association, you can find out by looking there, and their websites are linked so you could contact them. Checklists, practical examples, and we wrap it up with understanding the differences between advocating and lobbying so you can find out what you can do in your unique situation. And that's all I have, Michele. Do we want to take a moment for some questions or
Jackie, I have one question that came up as you were presenting. I think this is a good spot for it. So you did a good kind of overview of the toolkit, and during your presentation, you talked about PIAAC. There were some questions about what exactly PIAAC is. So maybe you can talk about, just spend a few minutes about what it is and why it's important and how it connects to the toolkit.
Okay, sure thing. So the PIAAC section, let's see, beginning on page 7, talks about that exact thing. What is PIAAC? So PIAAC stands for the Program for the International Assessment of Adult Competencies, and it's a large-scale international household study conducted by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. So what it does is it assesses the key cognitive and workplace skills that adults need to participate in the 21st century society successfully in a global economy. So these data, the synthetic data, Michele could probably do a better job of this than me, but the synthetic data breaks it down by local, by city, state, city in some instances, and by county and by state, so that you can say what level your adults in your county, what level of proficiency and literacy and numeracy, do they have, and how many adults in your county are at risk, and how, what percent, and how can you use that in writing grants, grant proposals, in messaging to public officials, and keeping your donor base informed. So does that answer the question? Michele or David, did you want to add?
Yeah, Jackie, no, I think that you summarized it well. And the only thing that I would add is that the important part about this is the state and county estimates. So you may have heard before of the National Adult Literacy Survey or the National Assessment of Adult Literacy. Those are done about every 10 years. The PIAAC was done in released in 2014. And it didn't have any local and state data, and programs really need that most. So we've been waiting for about 7 years for that to come out, and finally it did in 2020. So that's what the emphasis is on with this toolkit. It allows you to take a look at local areas, county areas, to really go to your local legislators and tell them what's going on in your particular area. That's the only thing I'd add.
Thank you.
Great.
Todd, any other questions that came up before?
Yeah, and actually, I think this question might be a great transition to David. So we have a question that says, a pro literacy toolkit is a great resource. As a new adult literacy program in my community, where should I start? What are the top 3 things I can be working on now to hit the ground running in January 2021? And David, I think that is exactly what you're going to talk about, right?
Some of that, yeah, absolutely. So let's dive into that. My role here is to talk about, actually from my perspective, how the toolkit can help you. There are many more ways that I won't be talking about that the tool can help you, but I will try to touch on, as a new program, what are some things in particular that I think you should pay attention to. So beginning with going back to the two heat maps or visual databases that both Michele and Jackie talked about, I want to talk a little bit about how you can use those. So for example, and just to repeat, I guess, there are two, one from the National Center for Educational Statistics, which is part of the U.S. Department of Education. That one is called the PIAAC Skills Map. And the other one is from the Barbara Bush Foundation, and it's called the Literacy Gap Map. And they're similar in some ways, but they also have some differences. So my suggestion is to look at both of these maps, and the maps are free, both of them. And what they will provide you, both of them will provide you, as Jackie mentioned, is adult literacy and numeracy data. And it's by state and by counties within the state. And you can go to the first two parts of the toolkit to get more information about that. But the part that I think is really powerful beyond that is that you can compare literacy and numeracy data with other kinds of data. And you can do that in different ways with each map, which is why I suggested looking at both of them. So for example, with the NCES PIAAC skills map, you get literacy and numeracy, but you can also compare it with other things. So for example, with gender or with level of education. And could I have the next slide, please? You can also compare it with, let's see, I lost my video for a second. There it is. You can also compare it with health. Very important. There is a high correlation with low literacy and health in many parts of the country. And if where you are, that is true, that is a very persuasive argument that you can make that will get people's attention beyond those who are interested in adult education and literacy. You can compare it with poverty rates. Turns out there is a high correlation in many parts of the country with poverty. Race and ethnicity, for immigrants, their ability to speak English, and employment status. Both of those are very important, and you can get the attention of policymakers who might not be interested or even know about adult literacy or adult basic skills education. You can get their attention because they're interested in health, or they're interested in getting people out of poverty, or they're interested in helping people get into the workforce, part of which may be, from their perspective, learning how to speak English. Next slide, please. There's also different ways using the Barbara Bush Foundation Literacy Gap Map that you can compare literacy and numeracy. You can, to start with, you can compare, using that map, you can compare the PIAAC literacy measures with the average nationally, or with the NOW, which was a previous National Assessment of Adult Literacy, it stands for. And it was, until the PIAAC data, the most recent data available to us. The PIAAC data, and this is important to know, this is the best data, national, actually international, because the US participated in the international PIAAC assessment, but the best national data that we have. And you can say that as you're meeting with policymakers. You could also compare it with the NAEP scores, the National Assessment of Educational Progress for K through 12. And you, for example, could compare it with the average reading scores for fourth graders. You can also, as you could with the NCES database, compare it with the English language level of immigrants. You can compare it with health measures, and that breaks down in the Barbara Bush Foundation data to access to health care. For example, certain diseases, diabetes, life expectancy, and others as well. Next slide, please. You can, using the Barbara Bush Foundation map, you can compare it with economic status and poverty. And you can see here a list of some of the things within the measure of poverty. So obviously household income, median household income, individuals or families below the federal poverty line, unemployment rates. Of course, this is the data from 2012 to 14. This is not the data that we're experiencing now because of the pandemic. And so any data you compare unemployment is going to be much worse than actually is displayed. But you could already see a pattern comparing unemployment with lack of literacy skills and numeracy skills for that matter. You can look at public assistance income. You can look at food stamps, that is SNAP benefits too. And you can also look at the Special Supplemental Nutrition Program, the WIC program. And you can look at education level, whether or not people have received a high school diploma and whether their children are enrolled in public or private school. Next slide, please. With the Barbara Bush Foundation, and those of you who may have already looked at this website before, you might want to come back to it because recently they have added some other kinds of comparative data. And I think this one at the top is going to be very important. You'll be able to look at, for your county and your state, the percentage or numbers of people who have a computer at home or have access to the internet at home, or who only have a smartphone, or who have only a cell phone data plan. And you can compare that with literacy and numeracy rates. It may well be that that data in itself is a compelling argument. There's a lot of interest among foundations and public policy makers now in trying to address the problems that they are now more aware of because of the pandemic that have to do with the digital divide. You can compare literacy and numeracy rates with housing, affordable housing, and lack of housing. And of course, with demographics, ethnicity and color, for example. Next one. And so that's it with the two databases, the two heat maps as they're called. But the toolkit can help you once you have the data and once, for example, you have put together your adult literacy impact report using the template that Michele showed you earlier and that is discussed in the toolkit, of course. You can use this to present the data. So who are you going to present it to? And this comes back to a consideration that many new programs and also existing programs need to think about. Well, one obvious group is state and local legislators, policymakers, to make the case for addressing the need for adult education and literacy skills. And when we say local, that's going to vary from where you are. It might be if you're in a large city, it might be the mayor, it might be the city council. In a small town, it might be the town manager, it might be a variation on the city council in your town. But that's clearly a high priority audience to present the data to. But it's not the only one. You might consider presenting it to community groups because you want to affect public opinion, because public opinion makes a difference to legislators. If other people in the community are raising the same issues about the same data that you've presented to both of these groups, it's going to elevate that in priority. So groups like service clubs, Kiwanis, Rotary, and others, faith-based organizations, ethnic and immigrant organizations. And this data will be of great interest, particularly around the comparison of English language data and literacy and numeracy data, and economic data such as employment. And there are other community-based organizations who you might want to present it to. You might also think about if your organization has a web page to put this data that you've collected and that's in your impact report. In fact, put your impact report up on your organization's web page. And you may also have an active social media presence. And if so, you'll certainly want to post that out, maybe in smaller pieces. And driving traffic to your web page so that people get the full picture of the information that you've collected. Next slide, please. Another way that the toolkit can help you, and you may already have a sense of this from Jackie's presentation, is it can help you if you've never done this before, particularly if you're a new program and have never done advocacy and are wondering, well, what do I say when I'm meeting with public policymakers or when I'm meeting with a community organization? How can I develop an effective message? And so the toolkit really drills down on that. And just to give you an idea, it will help you in identifying your allies, and building alliances, a very important part of advocacy. If you're the only voice advocating for adult literacy and adult learning, it's not as effective as if public libraries are advocating for it, job training programs are advocating for it, businesses, or if you have organized labor where you live, if labor unions are advocating for it. The more different sectors that are saying the same thing to the local policymakers, the more compelling your case is going to be. And so the toolkit will help you with that. It will also, if you've never written to a state legislator or called a state legislator, it will help you with that. It'll help you with meeting with legislators. And a very important part of the toolkit, I think, is it will help you do that online. Because now all meetings with legislators, at least in my part of the country, and perhaps in yours, are virtual. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Legislators are very interested in meeting with their constituents, and they are very accommodating in many cases. And the toolkit will give you some tips in how to do that. How do you think about a meeting? Maybe you've done many meetings with legislators, but you've never done it virtually. The toolkit will help you do that. When hearings are held again, post-pandemic in most cases, it'll give you some tips on how to think about testifying at hearings, what kinds of things you should focus on and what kinds of things you should probably avoid. And then finally, when this is possible, again, post-pandemic to be sure, how to organize rallies at the state capitol, for example. Next slide, please. And as Jackie mentioned, this toolkit will also help you advocate with individual donors. They need to be updated. They need to have a sense of what's going on. They are particularly interested in any changes that your program may have brought about as a result of its good work. But they're also interested in many cases in what's going on in the community. And who is supporting adult literacy and who maybe could be encouraged to support adult literacy and adult learning. Foundations, they need this data too. And in many cases, they will want this data, particularly if they already fund you or if they fund education but haven't thought about funding adult education and literacy. Presenting this data is a way to make your case with them and open the door to new funding that they have not made available to your program. And of course, corporations. And in many cases, there are corporate foundations who will be very interested in this. And part 4 of the toolkit will help you do that. It'll give you an opportunity in the appendix, particularly Appendix A, and also as I think Jackie mentioned, or Michelle mentioned, or maybe it was Todd who mentioned, the next webinar will actually focus on what other adult literacy advocacy groups have done. So that's Appendix A. You can read about that. You can actually hear their presentations and ask them questions about things that you're interested in. And Jackie mentioned you can go to Appendix C and find out if your state does already have a statewide adult learning and literacy advocacy organization. And Appendix G will help you to find grants and grant partners, which is always interesting to programs. Next slide, please. That was actually my last slide. I do have one comment before we talk about future webinars. And this is from my experience doing advocacy work in Massachusetts for decades, actually. I have found that the key to really successful advocacy, in addition to engaging programs, and by the way, by that I mean not only practitioners, but adult learners, very key to have adult learners involved in advocacy. But it's even more powerful if you have an active state organization. Maybe your state professional organization already does adult literacy advocacy at the state level. If not, you might try to make that happen. And coordinating that so that everybody is on the same page. So for example, you're presenting your state data in the same way, and you're asking, the ask to the state policymakers is all the same. It's the same line item, it's the same amount, so that they hear basically one voice from everybody. If they hear different voices from different programs, they generally throw up their hands and say, these folks have not got their act together. We'll wait till you organize yourselves and know what you want. So I'll leave it right there. I'll be glad to answer questions in just a minute.
Thanks, David. So in summary, Todd had mentioned 2 different webinars that are coming up. This webinar, we covered a lot in very brief way, but we want to create a series of webinars related to this toolkit because it's so large and because it looks at a lot of different areas. So the 2 that are coming up on December 9th are successful local and state advocacy efforts. This goes a little bit back to the question that somebody had about what can you do right now. We'll have some experts talk to, at the local and state level, talk about some successful advocacy campaigns that they have had and really get into how they were successful, challenges they had, and answer any questions for you. And then on the 16th, we're going to talk about making your case for adult education and literacy using PIAAC data. So where are some examples from local programs or even state programs that have been able to take that state and county information that we referenced and bring some visibility to adult education with funders or even with the media? We then want to take a little bit of a break for the holidays, of course, but we plan to have some additional webinars in January related to the Advocacy Toolkit. One that we know that we definitely want to do, Jackie mentioned, was virtual advocacy, because that is such an important topic right now. That's really the only way you can advocate. So we want to show you how to do that. So I will leave it there. Proliteracy.org/webinars. That's where all our webinars are listed. There's a calendar. You can go in and you can find the link for where to register. We will also send this out to everybody via e-blast a couple of different times so you're aware of these webinars. But I will stop it right there, and I guess we will go to question and answer. Todd, do we have any?
We have, I think we've addressed all the questions that have come up, so I'm just going to invite people to put their questions in now, and we'll get to them as soon as folks have had a chance to type them in. But I want to go back to the question that was kind of asked about where to start. What are 3 things that that I can start doing now so that I'm ready to hit the ground running in 2021? And David, you identified a lot of great uses for the tools and the data. And Jackie, you identified, all the different sections in, a very extensive toolkit. But if you had to identify kind of 1 or 2 sections of the toolkit for people to really focus on and get started if they didn't have time to read it all, or David, if you had to recommend kind of 1 or 2 entry points for advocacy and using the tools in the toolkit, like what would your advice be to people?
Well, first of all, if you've never done public policy advocacy before, the first step is to organize yourselves. So you might want to organize it at the program level and start by, at a staff meeting saying, look, if we're going to continue to thrive, we have to get involved in advocacy. And you might want to go to sections of the toolkit that really make it clear what advocacy is, and to deal with the issue that people are concerned that advocacy is lobbying. It's not. And you are allowed as individuals and citizens of the United States, and even if you're not a citizen, you are allowed to do public policy advocacy work. It's essentially education work with legislators and policymakers. And you're not prevented from doing that. So that's a really important point to make. And in the toolkit, Jackie has included a lot of material on that. Jackie, you can probably find where that is. Is it in the appendix? But I recall that it's there. The next thing you want to do is to organize adult learners, because their voices, quite honestly, are much more important than your voices, because legislators want to hear from their constituents. Now, some of your learners are not voters, they're not citizens, and they can't vote. But usually when you're meeting with a legislator, that's not an issue that they bring up. At least I've never run into that. They are interested in talking to people who live in their district, and they're very interested in hearing points of view that they haven't heard before and needs that they aren't aware of. And so they want to talk directly to students. They certainly want to hear from you, and they want to have the facts. They want a fact sheet on what the situation is. They certainly want to look at the PIAAC data that you're presenting them with. But they do want to talk to the students. And so don't underestimate the importance of that. And also simply because the number of students is much greater than the number of practitioners. And I include volunteers as well as paid practitioners. So if you really want to have an impact, you want to have the greatest number possible. You want to get students to participate. And participating could mean literally sending a postcard, making a phone call. It could mean writing a letter, could mean showing up at a State House rally. There are lots of different ways that they can participate. But I would start there. And I would also start, my second point would be to find out whether or not your state already has a professional association with an advocacy committee. And many states do. I see a couple of colleagues here from Illinois, and Illinois has a very active professional association with a strong advocacy group. Massachusetts does. Pennsylvania has for years. Many states do. And so check to see if your state does, if you don't know. And the third one would be to practice. And that means for practitioners and for adult learners that you want to do some run-throughs before you meet with policymakers. You want to get comfortable. You want to, first of all, you want to have the facts in your hands. You don't necessarily have to have them memorized, but you want to get comfortable with them. And so when you actually are meeting with a public policy person, you are comfortable in talking about, from a learner's perspective, about their experience in their program and why it's important to them, their story, so to speak, and practicing it so that they get it down to about a minute, which is about as much time as they'll have. And you will want to practice and be sure you're familiar with the fact sheet that you're presenting and being able to address any questions that the legislator might have about that.
Great. Great response. Jackie, Michelle, anything to add to that?
Sure. I thought I would just add, David, you did a great job outlining that. And what David, he's talking about being effective advocating with public policymakers, you can find those key elements on page 37, and they hot link in the document to those sections. So if you say to yourself, I really need to do a better job at involving adult learners in advocacy, that's one of the key elements. You just click on it and then it jumps down to that section. So you don't have to actually wade through page after page. So in every instance we had the opportunity, we tried to put a lot of cross linkages within the document, bookmarks and such, so that you can just jump right to the thing that you need. And I also wanted to add, I think David did a great job covering the public policy part, that if you're brand new program and you're not sure where to get started, I think I would get started with part 1, and I would go through the questions on planning your advocacy, questions to ask yourself, because Are you talking about advocating for private funding? So that would be grant writing and donor retention, donor acquisition, and all of this, or would it be public policy, or would it be really working on your messaging? And that, whatever determining your goal is really unique to you. So determining that goal and then using the toolkit to flip to the pages for the right tools to accomplish that goal. So what is it they say? To every I'm going to get it wrong now. To every hammer is everything's a nail, right? So that's not the case here, right? And so that's why there are so many different tools for you. So to decide, what it is you want to chip away at, and then it will link you to that section.
Great. And I think that brings us to another question. And David, I think you started to touch on this, that advocacy is really about education. And a lot of times we think about advocacy in terms of advocating for funding for our programs and things like that. The question is there anything in the toolkit that's geared to advocacy that isn't about funding, that is addressing how to do that larger education piece, perhaps?
Sure, I could start.
Yeah, Jackie, why don't you handle that?
Okay, there is, and we didn't want to replicate marketing toolkits. So there's whole toolkits out there that Pro Literacy has for marketing, but that's certainly one way where you're not asking for funding. You're just trying to raise awareness and educate your community and help build those alliances. So there is a great case study in there from the Literacy Cooperative in Cleveland, Ohio, on how they use social media to amplify their voice, and along with the PIAAC data. In fact, that last slide I had of the appendix, I didn't mention it, but it's a screenshot of their fact sheet, how they tailored a fact sheet for their area and their plans for the campaign. And they will be on the December 16 webinar. So that's one strategy. And then the messaging too. So whatever it is you're advocating for, it may not be for money, just raising awareness, really dialing in your message and getting good at being able to communicate no matter the angle you're taking, I think would be essential.
I would just add to this, and I'm not sure that we've specifically addressed this in the toolkit, but there is a different way to think about this, particularly if you are involving adult learners. And that is, this is an opportunity to create adult learner leadership skills, or to improve adult learner leadership skills. And with those leadership skills, they may use the same skills to address other important issues in their lives, their families' lives, and their communities' lives. So, for example, earlier I mentioned, or I may have mentioned, the issues around the internet and digital literacy and digital equity. This is a hot issue for many adult learners, and it is not specifically raising money for adult literacy. It's around providing internet access in what is now called internet deserts, in cities and in rural areas in particular. And so they may take the same skills that they're getting as part of this effort to use them in other ways. I also want to mention that there is another very important aspect of this, which is this is really, in many ways, democracy. This is democracy in action. And it's really summed up for me by a comment that a student made riding in a van back to his program after visiting the State House in Boston, Massachusetts. By the way, many of the images in the guide come from the Mass Alliance for Adult Literacy and Adult Learner Leadership Organization in Massachusetts, and the Mass Coalition for Adult Education, which organize rallies every year. Riding back from one of those rallies, this student was asked by a teacher in his program, "So what did you think of this? Had you ever been to the State House before?" He said, "No." I said, "Well, what was this experience like?" And he said, "Well, in my country, for what I just did, I would be in danger. I might have been killed. It's a great reminder of how important democracy really is to us and how important it is for us in educating adult learners to help them appreciate what a fabulous opportunity this is compared with opportunities in other countries which are not democracies.
Thank you, David. I think that's a great point to for all of us to remember. Um, so we have one more question. It is from Yasmin. And Yasmin, I apologize if I don't get this exactly right, but it says in the PIAAC description, page 10 of the toolkit, can you provide a concrete example of the kind of question that adults at level 2 could not do comfortably? So I think it is related to kind of understanding in practical terms what those different PIAAC level data mean and how to communicate that to maybe stakeholders or funders or legislators in helping them kind of have a real world grasp on what that data actually means.
I think that's a great question. And it's one I've struggled with before as well. And the best that I could come up with was, and it's in the toolkit, I'm trying to find exactly the page. I may not be able to grab it.
I think she said page 10, so that might be a good.
Yeah, so, but I linked to, it was the sample questions. There's a list of sample questions on the website that lists the types of things that students were asked and unable to answer at different levels.
Okay, so there's a link of example questions, a link to the PIAAC site that has example questions, and that link is in the toolkit. That's what,
yes.
Am I correct in that?
Yes, that's correct. So I'm going to dig it out here and then I'll share it in the chat, or maybe you could add it to the handout, Todd, if we don't have.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll make sure that that's in the handout. And I think that's something that a lot of us have struggled with. And I just want to remind people as we're getting to the top of the hour that if you do have a question, please go ahead and get that in. David and Jackie and Michelle have agreed to kind of stick around and make sure everybody's question is answered. We know that many of you have other places that you have to be. Our lives are full of Zoom meetings, but you're welcome to stick around and hear the answers to questions, but we are going to stop taking questions at the top of the hour. So now's the time to get them in. And I'll just use this time while you guys are typing those questions in to thank you again for attending the webinar and to remind you that you're going to get a follow-up email on Monday that has a recording, the slideshow. It'll have a summary handout for you to share. And just to let you know that because you signed up and attended this webinar, you will automatically get the emails that go out for the webinar on the 9th and the 16th. So keep an eye out for those emails.
Todd, this is David. I would just add that to answer Yasmin's question, that a good source of information about the PIAAC is from the PIAAC Gateway, and there is a link to that at the bottom of page 10. And I think you'll get a better sense of this if you go there.
Great. And so I am going to pull up the toolkit, go to the bottom of page 10, and post that link in the chat room for people real quick, and we will include that. Oh, there it is. Yep.
Yeah, Todd, this is Michelle. I would just add that for those who are unfamiliar with PIAAC and how it was conducted, that same PIAAC Gateway link that you're posting and David mentioned does provide more information about how the study was conducted. So you could sort of see the sample size, who was surveyed, the ages, the demographics, to give you a better picture of that overall.
I might add that my understanding is that the PIAAC will be conducted again. Is that your understanding, Michelle?
It is. My understanding is that it should be released in 2022. It does tend to be a little late from the folks at NCES, but that my understanding is that 2022 will be the next release.
All right. And I think that's it. We don't have any more questions. So I think we'll wrap it up and say thank you everyone for attending and have a great rest of the day.
Thanks, Todd. Thanks, presenters. Thanks for joining us, everybody.